A Roman emperor lost his throne in 476, and almost no one in Rome thought the world had ended. There was no final battle for the eternal city. No last legion dying around a golden eagle. No emperor in purple standing on the walls, while barbarian hordes crashed against the gates. The final emperor to rule from Italy was a teenager with an almost painfully symbolic name: Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus, Little Romulus. He carried the names of Rome's legendary founder and Rome's first emperor, but he possessed almost none of their power. Then a military commander named Odoacer removed him. Not with a world-ending apocalypse. With administration. The boy was deposed. According to later tradition, he was spared and sent away with a pension. The imperial insignia were sent east to Constantinople, where an emperor still ruled with real power. The message was simple, though its implications were enormous. The West no longer needed its own emperor. And that was it. The Western imperial office, the office of Augustus, Theodosius, Constantine, Diocletian, Marcus Aurelius, Hadrian, Trajan, Vespasian, and Augustus himself, simply stopped functioning in Italy. But here is the real mystery. How does an empire die so quietly? How does a state that once ruled the Mediterranean world reach the point where its end can be handled like a staffing change? Welcome to the History Docket, where history's greatest disasters are reopened. Before we begin this autopsy of the Western Roman Empire, give this episode a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave your verdict in the comments as the case unfolds. Because this is not a story about barbarians destroyed Rome. That version is too small. This is a case about an empire that became harder to tax, harder to defend, harder to govern, harder to believe in, and finally too hollow to survive the removal of one more emperor. Tonight's case is the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Not the fall of Rome in one day. Not one invasion. Not one villain. Not one battle. A long collapse of money, manpower, legitimacy, territory, loyalty, and political imagination. A system that had survived civil wars, plagues, assassinations, invasions, religious conflict, and economic strain, until the machinery that once recovered from disaster became part of the disaster itself. This is the anatomy of collapse. Chapter 1: The Day the Empire Did Not End. The year 476 is famous because historians needed a date. History loves dates because dates make chaos look organized. They give us a door to close. They give textbooks a line. Ancient Rome ends here. The Middle Ages begin here. One world dies. Another begins. But people living through history rarely experience it that cleanly. In 476, the Western Emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed by Odoacer, a military leader commanding troops in Italy. Romulus was the son of Orestes, a Roman military commander who had placed him on the throne the year before. But Romulus was not universally recognized. The more legitimate Western emperor, Julius Nepos, was still alive in Dalmatia after being driven from Italy. In the Eastern Empire, Emperor Zeno ruled from Constantinople and did not simply accept the Western political mess as normal. So even the phrase "the last emperor" is less simple than it sounds. Romulus Augustulus was the last Western emperor to rule from Italy. Julius Nepos was, in a more formal sense, the last Western emperor recognized by the East until his death in 480. And Odoacer did not announce that Rome had ended. He did not declare himself Roman emperor. He ruled Italy as king, nominally under the authority of the Eastern Emperor. The Senate continued. Roman administration continued in altered forms. Tax records did not dissolve overnight. People still married, traded, inherited, prayed, sued, farmed, paid rent, and complained. The world did not suddenly forget Latin on September 4, 476. That is what makes the fall so strange. The end of the Western Empire was not the disappearance of Roman civilization. It was the disappearance of the Western imperial state as a functioning political structure. Those are different things. Roman law continued to influence life. Roman elites continued to exist. Roman bishops became more important. Roman identity survived in various forms. The city of Rome remained inhabited and symbolically powerful. The Eastern Roman Empire continued for nearly 1,000 more years. The barbarian kings who ruled former Western provinces often wanted Roman legitimacy, Roman titles, Roman administrators, Roman taxes, Roman prestige, and Roman symbols. The empire did not vanish like a house in fire. It became other things. But the Western imperial state, the system that could collect taxes across provinces, pay armies, appoint officials, defend frontiers, impose emperors, coordinate strategy, and claim obedience from Britain to Africa, from Spain to Gaul, from Italy to the Danube, that state had failed. The case, then, is not simply, who killed Rome? The better question is, what failed so badly that no one could put the Western Empire back together? Because Rome had been wounded before. Many times. It had lost armies. It had lost emperors. It had lost cities. It had survived plague, usurpation, inflation, invasion, and civil war. For centuries, Rome's genius was not that it never suffered disaster. Rome's genius was that it recovered. By 476, that genius was gone. Chapter 2: The Empire that became too large for its old self. The Roman Empire did not begin as an empire that knew how to be won. That sounds odd, but it matters. Rome began as a city, then a city-state, then a power in Italy, then a Mediterranean conqueror, then a republic ruling territories far beyond the institutions originally designed for a city. By the time Augustus became the first emperor, Rome already possessed a vast imperial world. Provinces, armies, tax systems, client kings, roads, ports, governors, merchants, veterans, slaves, cities, temples, and legal traditions. The empire was built through conquest. But conquest is only the first stage. After conquest comes management. Rome became very good at management. It did not rule every province identically. It adapted. It co-opted elites. It built roads and cities. It used law and citizenship. It allowed local aristocrats to become Roman aristocrats. It turned conquered peoples into soldiers, taxpayers, officials, and eventually citizens. It created a political culture in which many local elites had reasons to participate in Roman order rather than destroy it. In 212, the Emperor Caracalla granted Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. The motives behind that edict included taxation and imperial policy, not only generosity, but the symbolic result was enormous. Roman identity had stretched far beyond the city of Rome. The empire was no longer simply Romans ruling non-Romans. It was a huge political civilization that had taught millions of people to think of themselves, in some sense, as part of Rome. But integration had a cost. The empire had to defend enormous frontiers. The Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates, the deserts of North Africa, the mountains and river systems of the Balkans, the coasts of the Mediterranean, the seas themselves. Rome's borders were not walls in the simple modern sense. They were zones of forts, roads, supply systems, local treaties, allied tribes, garrisons, watch posts, cities, and military commands. Defense required money. Money required taxation. Taxation required administration. Administration required legitimacy. Legitimacy required success. For a long time, the machine worked well enough. The empire's wealth was immense. The Mediterranean was a Roman lake. Grain moved across seas. North Africa fed cities. Egypt remained a jewel of the imperial system. Spain produced minerals and agricultural goods. Gaul was wealthy and urbanized. The East was rich, dense, and economically vital. Italy held symbolic centrality. The army absorbed men from across the empire. Emperors could be assassinated, but the imperial structure endured. Yet the empire contained a permanent danger. The army made emperors. The emperor paid the army. The provinces funded the emperor. The frontier required the army. The army could decide the emperor was unworthy. This circular structure was powerful but unstable. When succession worked, the empire could function. When succession failed, armies backed rival claimants. Civil war followed. Civil war weakened frontiers. Weakened frontiers invited invasion. Invasion required more troops. More troops required more money. More money required heavier taxation. Heavier taxation increased resentment. Resentment weakened loyalty. This cycle did not always spin out of control. But when it did, the empire shook. In the 3rd century, it nearly broke. Chapter 3: The 3rd Century Warning. Long before 476, Rome received a warning so severe it should have changed everything forever. The crisis of the 3rd century. From roughly 235 to 284, the empire endured a storm of civil wars, short-lived emperors, military revolts, foreign invasions, plague, economic instability, breakaway regimes, and administrative strain. Emperors rose and fell with terrifying speed. Armies proclaimed commanders emperor. Frontier pressures intensified. The Persians under the Sasanian dynasty became a dangerous eastern rival. Germanic groups crossed frontiers. The empire briefly split into separate power centers, including the Gallic Empire in the west and the Pomeranian power in the east. This was not a minor crisis. It was a rehearsal for collapse. And yet Rome survived. That survival is crucial. It proves that Rome was not doomed simply because it faced invasion or civil war. The empire could be battered and still recover if it produced rulers and reforms strong enough to reassemble the system. The man most associated with that recovery was Diocletian. Diocletian came to power in 284 and did something extraordinary. He looked at the empire and accepted that it had become too large and too unstable for one man to govern effectively in the old way. His solution was radical: divide imperial responsibility. The Tetrarchy. Rule of 4. 2 senior emperors called Augusti. 2 junior emperors called Caesars. The idea was to provide stronger regional defense, clearer succession, and more responsive government. Instead of one emperor racing from frontier to frontier, multiple rulers could command different zones while presenting themselves as part of one imperial system. This was not the fall of Rome. It was an attempt to save Rome. Diocletian also reformed taxation, administration, the army, and imperial ceremony. The empire became more bureaucratic, more hierarchical, more openly autocratic in its court style. The emperor became more remote, more sacred, more surrounded by ritual. The old pretense that the emperor was merely the first citizen had largely vanished. The empire needed command, revenue, and stability. Then came Constantine. Constantine defeated rivals, reunited power, made Christianity a favored imperial religion, and founded a new capital at Constantinople in 330 on the site of Byzantium. The new city was strategically placed, defensible, wealthy, and closer to the empire's richest eastern provinces and one of its most dangerous frontiers. This decision changed Roman history. Constantinople would become one of the greatest cities in the world. It would preserve Roman imperial authority in the East long after the West fell. But it also shifted gravity. Rome, the old city, remained symbolically sacred, but power increasingly lived elsewhere. The empire of Diocletian and Constantine was not the old empire of Augustus. It was more militarized, more taxed, more bureaucratic, more Christian, more court-centered, and more openly divided for practical governance. These reforms saved the empire in the short and medium term. They also revealed the scale of the problem. The Roman world could survive only by becoming heavier. More administration, more taxation, more military organization, more imperial ceremony, more coercion, more dependence on rulers capable of managing complexity. A system can become strong by becoming heavy. But if the resources supporting that weight begin to shrink, the weight becomes dangerous. Chapter 4: Two Courts, One Empire and the Problem of Distance. It is tempting to say the Roman Empire simply split in two, East and West. That is partly true, but too simple. Romans did not usually think they had created two entirely separate empires in the modern sense. There was one Roman Empire, often governed by more than one emperor. Administrative division was practical. Political unity remained an ideal. Laws could be issued jointly. Dynastic ties mattered. Eastern and Western emperors could cooperate, compete, or ignore each other depending on circumstances. But over time, the differences grew. The eastern half of the empire was generally richer, more urbanized, more densely populated, and more fiscally resilient. It contained wealthy provinces like Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor. Its cities were stronger. Its tax base was deeper. Constantinople was a superb capital. The western half had strengths too. Italy, North Africa, southern Gaul, Spain, and parts of the Rhine and Danube regions were significant. But the west faced severe strategic problems. Its frontiers were long and vulnerable. Its tax base became more fragile. Its political center shifted repeatedly: Rome, Milan, Trier, Ravenna. Its army increasingly depended on generals of non-Roman origin, federate troops, and fragile military bargains. Its court politics became deeply unstable. The empire's division did not automatically doom the West, but it meant that Western crises could become Western crises. If the West lost tax provinces, the East might not always rescue it. If the West suffered usurpations, the East might choose caution. If the West needed troops, the East had its own enemies. If the West was ruled by weak emperors, Eastern strength could not always substitute for Western authority. Distance mattered. Communication mattered. Political trust mattered. And trust between courts was not guaranteed. In 395, Emperor Theodosius died. He was the last emperor to rule both Eastern and Western halves effectively as a single ruler. After him, his sons Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west inherited the imperial division. Both were young. Neither was a towering figure. Real power fell to court factions, generals, and ministers. The empire did not collapse in 395. But the post-Theodosian world exposed how much Rome depended on strong leadership. In the east, Constantinople had resources and eventually found a way to stabilize. In the west, the imperial court under Honorius faced one of the most dangerous moments in Roman history. The Goths were inside the empire, and they wanted a settlement. Chapter 5: The Goths and the Bargain That Failed. The Goths had been part of Rome's frontier world for generations before they became Rome's nightmare. They were not a single timeless people marching unchanged across history. Gothic groups shifted, formed, divided, allied, fought, and transformed through contact with Rome and other powers. They traded with Romans, served in Roman armies, raided Roman territory, sought refuge, and negotiated with imperial authorities. In 376, a major group of Goths crossed the Danube into the Roman Empire, seeking refuge from the Huns. This was one of the pivotal moments in Roman history. The empire allowed them in. That decision was not irrational. Rome had often settled barbarian groups inside imperial territory and used them as soldiers or taxpayers. Properly managed, such groups could strengthen the empire. They could provide manpower. They could be integrated. But in 376, management failed. Roman officials exploited the refugees, mistreated them, and helped create a revolt. The situation escalated into war. In 378, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Goths defeated a Roman army and killed the Eastern Emperor Valens. Adrianople was a shock. A Roman emperor died in battle against a barbarian force inside imperial territory. The empire survived, but the lesson was severe. Mismanaged outsiders could become a deadly internal military problem. Theodosius eventually settled the Goths within the empire. The settlement is debated in its exact nature, but the result was that a large Gothic group remained inside imperial territory with a degree of collective identity and military power. They were not simply absorbed and dissolved. They became a force to be negotiated with. One of the leaders who emerged from this world was Alaric. Alaric wanted position, recognition, land, payment, and status within the Roman system. He did not begin as a man trying to erase Rome. He wanted a place in Rome's world, but on terms that matched his power. This is one of the recurring tragedies of the late empire. Many barbarian leaders did not want to destroy Rome at first. They wanted to be paid by Rome, recognized by Rome, employed by Rome, married into Rome, titled by Rome, settled by Rome, or legitimated by Rome. But if Rome could not integrate them, they became enemies. Alaric and the Goths moved through imperial politics like a blade looking for an opening. They were used, resisted, negotiated with, betrayed, and denied. In the Western Empire, power was held not only by the young Emperor Honorius, but by the great general Stilicho, himself of mixed Roman and Vandal background and deeply embedded in Roman service. Stilicho was one of the last Western commanders with the talent and authority to hold the system together. He fought Goths. He fought other invaders. He managed court politics. He tried to preserve the West under nearly impossible conditions. Then the court killed him. In 408, amid suspicion, intrigue, and fear that Stilicho was plotting, Honorius allowed or ordered his execution. Stilicho's fall was followed by violence against families of barbarian soldiers serving Rome, pushing many of those soldiers toward Alaric. This was a catastrophic self-inflicted wound. Rome removed one of its few effective defenders, and alienated military manpower it desperately needed. Alaric marched on Rome. Chapter 6: The Sack That Shook the World. In 410, Rome was sacked by the Goths. For the first time in nearly 800 years, the city of Rome fell to a foreign enemy. The psychological impact was enormous. Rome was no longer the effective political capital of the West. The court was at Ravenna, but symbolically, Rome was still Rome. It was the eternal city, the city of apostles Peter and Paul, the old mistress of the world, the place whose name defined the empire. For pagans and Christians alike, the sack demanded explanation. How could this happen? Had the old gods abandoned Rome because Christians had rejected them? Had God punished Rome for sin? Had imperial weakness invited judgment? Was the world ending? Augustine would write The City of God partly in response to the shock, arguing that no earthly city, not even Rome, could be the final home of Christian hope. But politically, the sack of 410 was not the end of the Western Empire. That is important. Rome had been humiliated, but the state continued. The Goths did not stay and rule the city as masters of a new Italy. Alaric died soon afterward. His followers eventually moved into Gaul and Spain, and over time the Visigothic kingdom emerged within the Western imperial world. The sack of 410 was a warning, a terrifying warning. It showed that the West could not protect even its symbolic heart if political and military systems failed. It showed that barbarian groups inside the empire could become kingmakers and city takers. It showed that the imperial court at Ravenna could survive while Rome suffered, a fact that revealed the separation between symbol and power. But the empire still had resources. It still had Africa. It still had parts of Gaul and Spain. It still had Italy. It still had generals. It still had the imperial name. It could still recover. The problem was that the blows kept coming. A state can survive a sack. It cannot survive endless erosion if every recovery is weaker than the last. Chapter 7: The Rhine Gives Way. Around the end of 406, according to the traditional chronology, groups including Vandals, Alans, and Sueves crossed the Rhine into Roman Gaul. The exact circumstances are debated, including the famous image of a frozen Rhine, but the larger event is clear. The Rhine frontier failed dramatically. Gaul was invaded. The Western Empire was already strained. Troops had been moved. Civil wars distracted command. Usurpers arose in Britain and Gaul. The imperial government struggled to respond. What followed was not one clean invasion, but years of movement, settlement, conflict, and fragmentation. The Vandals, Alans, and Sueves eventually moved into Spain. The Sueves established power in the northwest. The Vandals and Alans continued their path, eventually crossing into North Africa in 429 under King Gizeric. This migration would become one of the most consequential in Roman history. At first glance, Gaul and Spain were disasters enough, but the loss that truly crippled the West came when the Vandals took Africa. To understand why, we must talk about money. Empires die in dramatic images, but they survive through revenue. Chapter 8: The Tax Spine. The Roman army was expensive. The late Roman state depended on taxation to pay soldiers, supply armies, maintain administration, support courts, and manage public functions. Taxes came in money and kind. Grain, animals, textiles, equipment, and labor all mattered. The state needed predictable revenue to maintain predictable force. Without taxes, no army. Without army, no provinces. Without provinces, no taxes. This is the fatal loop of imperial collapse. The Western Empire could endure invasion if it retained enough tax base to rebuild armies and reassert control. But when provinces fell permanently outside imperial taxation, the state's ability to recover shrank. It could not simply call forth legions from memory. It needed land, taxpayers, and administrative machinery. North Africa was critical. Roman Africa was wealthy, productive, and vital to the grain supply, especially for Italy and Rome. Its cities and estates generated revenue. Its relative security had long made it one of the Western Empire's great assets. If Italy was symbolic, Africa was fiscal oxygen. When the Vandals crossed into Africa, they did not merely invade another province. They threatened the Western state's financial heart. The Vandal movement into Africa was connected to Roman internal conflict. The general Boniface, caught in struggles with the Western court and rivals, has often been associated with the Vandals' entry, though the exact nature of invitation, miscalculation, or opportunity is debated. What matters is the pattern. Roman factional conflict opened doors to external forces. Gizeric was not a mindless barbarian. He was one of the most capable rulers of the 5th century. He understood power, negotiation, naval strategy, and opportunity. The Vandals advanced through North Africa, and in 439 they captured Carthage. This was one of the true body blows to the Western Empire. Carthage was not only a famous old city, it was a strategic and economic prize. With Carthage, the Vandals gained access to ships, ports, revenue, and a base from which to dominate the Western Mediterranean. They became a naval power. They threatened Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, Italy, and maritime supply routes. The Western Empire did not merely lose land. It lost income. And because it lost income, it lost the ability to restore power elsewhere. This is why the Vandal conquest of Africa may matter more than the sack of Rome in 410. The sack humiliated Rome. The loss of Africa starved the Western imperial state. Chapter 9. The generals who ruled the emperors. As the Western Empire weakened, emperors became increasingly dependent on military strongmen. This did not happen overnight. Roman emperors had long depended on armies and generals, but in the 5th century West, the pattern intensified. Emperors were often young, weak, short-lived, or politically constrained. Real power lay with commanders who controlled troops, negotiated with barbarian groups, and managed court factions. Stilicho, Constantius III, Aetius, Ricimer, Gundobad, Orestes, Odoacer. Some were of Roman background, some were of barbarian origin. Many operated inside Roman systems of title and legitimacy. The issue was not ethnicity alone. A man of barbarian origin could be deeply Roman in political role. Stilicho served the empire. Aetius used Hunnic alliances and barbarian forces while defending Roman interests. Ricimer, of mixed Suevic and Gothic background, became the power behind Western emperors. The deeper issue was the separation between imperial office and military power. The emperor had legitimacy. The general had force. When those were united in a strong ruler, the system could work. When they separated, the state became unstable. Generals made emperors. Generals unmade emperors. Emperors plotted against generals. Generals needed puppet emperors to legitimize their rule. The court became a place where the question was not how to restore the empire, but which faction could control the remaining imperial machinery. Aetius is one of the most important figures in this middle stage. Flavius Aetius, sometimes called the last of the Romans, dominated Western politics for decades. He used alliances with the Huns, fought rival Roman factions, managed barbarian groups in Gaul, and held together a Western order that was already deeply compromised. His greatest moment came in 451 against Attila the Hun at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. Chapter 10: Attila and the Last Coalition. The Huns had transformed the political landscape of Europe. Their pressure had helped drive Gothic and other movements decades earlier. Under Attila, they became a terrifying imperial power in their own right, extracting tribute, threatening both Eastern and Western Roman territories, and dominating a confederation of peoples. Attila's empire was not like Rome. It was more personal, more tribute-based, more dependent on the charisma and military force of the ruler. But in the mid-5th century, it was one of the greatest threats Europe had ever seen. In 451, Attila invaded Gaul. Aetius responded by forming a coalition. This is crucial. The Western Roman army alone was no longer what it had once been. To resist Attila, Aetius needed allies, including the Visigoths under King Theodoric I. Former enemies and semi-independent powers now had to cooperate under Roman coordination to stop a greater threat. At the Catalonian Plains, also called Chalons, Attila was checked. The battle was bloody and complex. It did not destroy the Huns completely, but it prevented Attila from achieving a decisive conquest in Gaul. Theodoric died in the battle. Aetius survived. Roman prestige gained one last great military moment. But the victory revealed weakness as much as strength. Rome could still coordinate. It could still inspire alliance. It could still fight. But it could not fight as the old empire had fought. It depended on federate kingdoms and semi-autonomous powers. The Visigoths were not simply Roman subjects. The Franks, Burgundians, and other groups were becoming powers in their own right. The empire in Gaul was no longer a direct imperial machine. It was a network of negotiated authorities. The following year, Attila invaded Italy. Cities suffered. The imperial center trembled. Pope Leo I famously met Attila, and later tradition magnified the meeting into a dramatic turning point. The reasons Attila withdrew were likely multiple: supply problems, disease, pressure elsewhere, and diplomacy. Once again, Rome survived. Then Attila died in 453. The Hunnic Empire fragmented quickly after his death. One might think this would help the Western Empire recover. But the West was too damaged to seize the opportunity fully. In 454, Emperor Valentinian III murdered Aetius during a palace confrontation. The emperor killed the one general most capable of holding the Western system together. A courtier reportedly told Valentinian that he had cut off his right hand with his left. The line may be literary, but the meaning is perfect. Valentinian removed Aetius. The empire did not become stronger. It became more exposed. The next year, Valentinian himself was assassinated. Rome's center continued to eat its defenders. Chapter 11: The Vandal Sack of Rome. In 455, Rome was sacked again. This time by the Vandals. The sequence was a political disaster. Valentinian III had arranged a marriage alliance involving his daughter and the Vandal royal house. After Valentinian's murder, The new Emperor Petronius Maximus tried to secure power, perhaps forcing Valentinian's widow Licinia Eudoxia into marriage and breaking or threatening Vandal interests. Gyseric used the crisis as a pretext. The Vandals sailed from Africa to Italy. Rome was vulnerable. Petronius Maximus tried to flee and was killed by a mob. Gyseric entered the city. The Vandal sack of 455 involved extensive looting and the taking of captives, though later use of the word vandalism has sometimes exaggerated or moralized the event beyond its historical specifics. The Vandals were not simply smashing for the joy of smashing. They were seizing wealth, prestige, and leverage. Again, the symbolic humiliation was immense. Rome had been sacked twice within half a century. But the deeper issue was not that Rome, the city, had been looted. It was that the Western imperial government could not protect its symbolic capital, could not recover Africa, could not stabilize succession, and could not prevent external rulers from intervening directly in imperial politics. The Vandals were not merely raiders. They were now a rival maritime state controlling Rome's lost fiscal heart. As long as Gyseric held Africa, the Western Empire bled. Recovering Africa became the central strategic necessity. Several attempts were made. The most important came in 468. It failed catastrophically. Chapter 12. The expedition that might have saved the West. If we are looking for one of the last moments when the Western Empire might have changed its fate, we must look to the great expedition against the Vandals in 468. This was a massive joint effort involving the Eastern and Western empires. The Eastern Emperor Leo I committed enormous resources. The Western Emperor Anthemius, placed on the throne with Eastern support, hoped to restore the West's fortunes. The goal was clear: recover Africa, destroy Vandal power, restore revenue, and give the Western state the financial base it needed to survive. This was not a minor operation. It was one of the largest military expeditions of late antiquity. If it succeeded, the history of the West might have looked different. That is not fantasy. Recovering Africa would not automatically solve every Western problem, but it would restore tax revenue, grain supply, naval security, and prestige. It would weaken the Vandals and strengthen the Western court. It might allow the empire to rebuild armies and reassert authority in Italy, Gaul, and Spain. The expedition failed. The Eastern commander Basiliscus mishandled the campaign. Gyseric used diplomacy, delay, and fire ships to destroy or scatter much of the Roman fleet near Cape Bon. The losses were enormous. The financial cost was devastating, especially for the Eastern Empire, though the East was strong enough eventually to recover. The West was not. The failure of 468 was perhaps the last great missed chance. After it, the Western Empire's recovery became far less likely. Anthemius, the Western emperor associated with the Eastern-backed restoration attempt, was eventually killed amid conflict with Ricimer, the powerful general who dominated Western politics. Once again, internal rivalry followed external failure. The pattern is relentless. Rome identifies the right problem. Rome attempts a solution. The solution fails. Then Roman factions turn on each other. Every failure becomes not a reason for unity, but an opportunity for another power struggle. By the 470s, the Western Empire was a shell. Not empty everywhere. Not meaningless, but structurally broken. Chapter 13. Ricimer and the Puppet Throne. Ricimer is one of the key suspects in the last phase of the Western Empire. He was a military leader of Suevic and Gothic ancestry, and because of that ancestry and his Arian Christian background, he could not easily claim the imperial throne for himself in the Roman political culture of Italy. Instead, he controlled emperors: Majorian, Libius Severus, Anthemius, Olybrius. The Western throne became something Ricimer could influence, manage, or destroy. But Ricimer was not merely a villain twirling a dagger behind a curtain. He operated in a world where the imperial office had already weakened. He needed emperors because Roman legitimacy still mattered. The empire needed generals because military power had become indispensable. The arrangement was unstable because neither side could fully trust the other. One of Ricimer's emperors, Majorian, deserves special attention. Majorian ruled from 457 to 461 and was one of the last Western emperors who seriously attempted restoration. He campaigned in Gaul and Spain, sought reform, tried to rebuild Roman authority, and prepared a major expedition against the Vandals. His fleet, assembled in Spain, was destroyed or captured before it could sail effectively, likely through Vandal action and perhaps treachery or negligence. Majorian's failure was not from lack of seriousness. He may have been one of the last men with the energy and vision to restore the West. Ricimer had him deposed and executed in 461. This is one of the crucial tragedies. The Western Empire did produce capable men. It did not protect them. Stilicho was killed. Aetius was killed. Majorian was killed. Anthemius was killed. Roman politics repeatedly destroyed the very leaders who might have extended the state's life. Why? Because capable leaders threatened other power centers. A weak emperor was manageable. A strong emperor might punish generals, reform taxes, discipline aristocrats, restore central authority, and change the balance of power. A collapsing state often punishes competence, because competence threatens the arrangements that allow powerful insiders to survive collapse. That is one of the darkest lessons in this case. Rome did not lack talent. It lacked a political system capable of using talent without devouring it. Chapter 14: The aristocrats who stayed rich while the state grew poor. The Western Empire's decline was not only military, it was social and fiscal. The Roman aristocracy remained wealthy in many regions even as the imperial state weakened. Great landowners held estates, influence, local authority, and cultural prestige. Senators in Italy, Gaul, and elsewhere could survive regime change by adapting to new rulers. They might prefer Roman order, but they also had local interests. If the imperial center could no longer protect them or offered only taxation without security, cooperation with barbarian kings could become rational. This is a critical point. The Roman state and Roman elites were not identical. An aristocrat might remain rich after the imperial tax system collapsed. A local bishop might gain authority as imperial officials faded. A landowner might negotiate with a Gothic or Burgundian king and preserve his estate. A city might adapt to new masters rather than die for Ravenna. The empire needed elites to support taxation and administration. But if elites could survive without the empire, their commitment weakened. Taxation became harder to sustain as territories were lost and burdens increased on what remained. Heavy taxes could alienate landowners and peasants, but without taxes, the state could not pay armies. Without armies, it could not protect taxpayers. Without protection, taxpayers had less reason or ability to pay. The loop tightened. In the Eastern Empire, The tax base remained deeper and the administrative system more resilient. In the West, the loss of Africa, the fragmentation of Gaul and Spain, and the instability of Italy made the fiscal crisis far worse. An empire does not die when poor people are poor. Empires often survive that. An empire dies when the state can no longer extract enough resources from wealth to defend the system that protects wealth. The Western Empire reached that point. Chapter 15: The Barbarian Question. Were the barbarians responsible for the fall of the Western Roman Empire? Yes and no. Yes, because Gothic, Vandal, Hun, Frankish, Burgundian, Suevic, Allan, and other groups placed enormous pressure on Roman territory, armies, and politics. They crossed frontiers, seized provinces, formed kingdoms, defeated Roman forces, sacked cities, and reduced imperial revenue. It would be absurd to pretend they were irrelevant. But no, if by barbarians, we imagine a simple outside force smashing a healthy empire. Many barbarian groups were deeply entangled with Rome before they ruled Roman land. They served in Roman armies. They held Roman titles. They negotiated with Roman officials. They sought settlement within Roman territory. They used Roman law, coinage, administration, and symbolism. Their leaders often wanted recognition from the emperor. The line between Roman and barbarian was real, but not always simple. A Gothic soldier could serve Rome. A Roman general could be of barbarian ancestry. A barbarian king could employ Roman administrators. A Roman aristocrat could serve a barbarian ruler. The late empire was not a story of pure Romans versus pure outsiders. It was a story of a Roman system, increasingly unable to control the military migrants and federate powers it needed. The federate system, settling groups under treaty in exchange for military service, could work under strong conditions. But if the state could not pay, supervise, command, or integrate these groups effectively, federates could become semi-independent armies inside the empire. The Visigoths became a kingdom in Gaul and Spain. The Vandals built a kingdom in Africa. The Burgundians established themselves in Gaul. The Franks expanded in northern Gaul. These kingdoms did not simply replace Rome with chaos. They often preserved Roman practices, but they removed territory from direct imperial control. That was the fatal issue. The empire could tolerate barbarian soldiers. It could tolerate barbarian generals. It could tolerate negotiated settlements. It could not indefinitely tolerate losing the tax base that made the imperial army possible. Chapter 16: Religion, Cause, Symptom, or Scapegoat. Did Christianity cause the fall of Rome? This question has haunted the subject for centuries. The responsible answer is no, not in any simple form. The Eastern Roman Empire was Christian and survived. Many barbarian kingdoms were Christian, often Arian Christian. Christian bishops sometimes helped maintain civic order as imperial structures weakened. The church preserved literacy, networks, charity, and forms of authority. Christianity did not make the empire unable to fight. But religion did change the empire. It changed culture, patronage, identity, law, and the relationship between spiritual and political authority. The imperial state after Constantine used Christianity as a source of unity, but Christian disputes also created conflict. Theological controversies consumed attention and shaped alliances. In some areas, religious differences between Nicene Romans and Arian barbarian rulers mattered politically. In others, bishops became mediators between populations and new kings. Christianity was not the assassin. It was part of the transformed world in which the Western Empire fell. Blaming Christianity alone is too convenient. It turns a complex fiscal, military, and political collapse into a moral argument. It also fails to explain why the richer Christian East survived. The real religious lesson is subtler. As the Western imperial state weakened, the Church became one of the institutions capable of outliving it. Bishops could remain when governors vanished. Christian identity could connect communities when imperial administration faltered. The Bishop of Rome gained importance as imperial power in the West faded. In that sense, Christianity did not destroy the Western Empire. It inherited some of the space the empire could no longer fill. Chapter 17: Why the East Survived. If we want to understand why the West fell, we must ask why the East did not. The Eastern Roman Empire faced enormous dangers too. Goths, Huns, Persians, religious conflict, court intrigue, usurpation, economic strain. Yet it survived the 5th century. It preserved imperial continuity, defended Constantinople, maintained a stronger tax base, and eventually under Justinian in the 6th century even reconquered parts of the Western Mediterranean, including North Africa and Italy, though at great cost. Why did the East survive? First, wealth. The East had richer provinces, denser populations, more resilient cities, and stronger revenue. Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor were fiscal pillars. A stronger tax base meant a stronger ability to pay armies and recover from crises. Second, geography. Constantinople was extraordinarily defensible. Its walls, position, and access to sea routes made it far harder to capture than Rome, Milan, or Ravenna as a strategic center. The Danube and eastern frontiers remained dangerous, but the capital itself was a fortress city of immense value. Third, political management. The Eastern Court often did a better job of redirecting or neutralizing threats. It could use diplomacy, payments, military force, and internal political maneuvering to survive. It was not always admirable, but it was often effective. Fourth, the East was not stripped of its fiscal heart, in the same way the West lost Africa. The East suffered invasions, but it did not lose Egypt or Asia Minor in the 5th century. Its core revenue remained intact. Fifth, the East could sometimes let the West absorb shocks. This is uncomfortable but true. Some barbarian movements went west. Some threats that might have devastated the East were deflected, negotiated away, or found better opportunities elsewhere. The survival of the East proves that the Roman imperial system was not automatically obsolete. Under the right conditions, it could endure. The West fell because its conditions deteriorated beyond recovery. Weaker revenue, stronger fragmentation, loss of Africa, repeated civil conflict, dependence on military strongmen, and failure to stabilize frontier groups. The Roman Empire did not fall in 476. The western half lost the capacity to remain imperial. The eastern half still had it. Chapter 18: The Child on the Throne. By the time Romulus Augustulus became emperor in 475, the Western imperial office had become almost theatrical. His father, Orestes, was the real power. Orestes had once served Attila the Hun as a secretary or official and later entered Roman service. He became a commander in Italy and rebelled against Emperor Julius Nepos, who fled to Dalmatia. Orestes then placed his young son Romulus on the throne. The boy's name was almost too symbolic. Romulus, founder of Rome. Augustulus, little Augustus. the beginning and the empire reduced to a child's nickname. But symbolism did not command troops. Orestes faced demands from his soldiers, many of whom wanted land in Italy. Land grants to military groups had become a major issue. Foederati and soldiers expected compensation. The state lacked money and options. Orestes refused their demands. They turned to Odoacer. Odoacer led the revolt. Orestes was captured and killed. Romulus was deposed. Odoacer did not bother appointing another Western emperor. That decision matters. For decades, generals had used puppet emperors because the office still had political value. By 476, Odoacer judged he could rule Italy without one. He sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople and asked to govern under the Eastern emperor's authority. The Western Senate adapted to this arrangement and perhaps helped frame it. The imperial office in the West had become unnecessary. That was the true end. Not because Rome had no Roman people left. Not because all institutions vanished. But because the title, Western Emperor, no longer solved any political problem. It did not pay troops. It did not recover Africa. It did not command Gaul. It did not protect Italy. It did not unite generals. It did not intimidate barbarian kings. It did not generate revenue. It had become a costume without a state. Odoacer removed the costume. Chapter 19, Julius Nepos and the Awkward Truth. The story of 476 becomes messier because Julius Nepos was still alive. He had been appointed Western Emperor with Eastern support in 474. In 475, Orestes forced him out of Italy, but Nepos continued to rule in Dalmatia and was still recognized by the Eastern Emperor Zeno as the legitimate Western Emperor. He remained alive until 480, when he was assassinated. So was 476 really the fall? In practical Italian terms, yes. Romulus was the last emperor resident in Italy. Odoacer's deposition ended the practice of maintaining a Western imperial court there. In formal legitimacy terms, the Western imperial line lingered until Nepos' death. In administrative and cultural terms, Roman structures continued under Odoacer and later Theodoric the Ostrogoth. In Eastern Roman terms, the empire continued from Constantinople. This messiness is not a problem. It is the point. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not a guillotine. It was a long loss of function, followed by an administrative recognition that the function was gone. 476 is useful because it marks the end of one office in Italy. But the office had been dying for decades. The Western Empire did not fall because Romulus Augustulus was deposed. Romulus Augustulus was deposed because the Western Empire had already fallen as a functioning system. Chapter 20, The World After the West. After 476, Italy did not become a wasteland. Odoacer ruled as king. He maintained many Roman administrative practices. The Senate continued to exist. Roman aristocrats continued to serve. Coins were minted in the name of the Eastern Emperor. The legal fiction of imperial unity remained useful. Then Theodoric the Ostrogoth came. Sent or encouraged by the Eastern Emperor Zeno to deal with Odoacer, Theodoric invaded Italy, defeated Odoacer after a long struggle, and killed him in 493. Theodoric then ruled Italy as king, maintaining a remarkable fusion of Gothic military power and Roman civil administration. Under Theodoric, Italy experienced a period of relative stability compared with the chaos that had preceded it. This again complicates the old picture. The replacement of Western emperors by barbarian kings did not mean instant cultural collapse everywhere. In some places, local Roman elites found new arrangements. Cities continued, law continued, taxes continued in modified form. The church grew in authority. Latin culture survived. But the political map had changed beyond recognition. The Visigoths ruled in Spain and parts of Gaul. The Vandals ruled Africa until the Eastern Empire conquered them in the 6th century. The Franks expanded in Gaul. The Burgundians held territory. The Ostrogoths ruled Italy. Britain had slipped from imperial control earlier and entered its own post-Roman transformations. The Western imperial state no longer existed to coordinate the whole. That loss mattered. A world of kingdoms replaced a world of provinces. Roman civilization did not end. Roman unity did. Chapter 21, The Suspects. The fall of the Western Roman Empire has too many suspects for a simple verdict. The barbarians stand first in popular imagination. They invaded, settled, fought, sacked, and ruled. Without Gothic, Vandal, Hun, Frankish, and other pressures, the West would not have collapsed in the same way. But they were not a meteor from outside history. They were deeply involved in Roman military and political systems. Rome used them, settled them, hired them, betrayed them, and depended on them. The emperors stand accused. Some were weak, some were children, some were puppets, some were reckless, some killed their best generals, but the imperial office itself had become nearly impossible in the West. A strong emperor needed an army, revenue, and elite support. Those were precisely what the system was losing. The generals stand accused. They dominated politics, made and unmade emperors, fought rivals, and sometimes prioritized personal power over imperial recovery. Yet many generals were also the only figures capable of defending what remained. Stilicho, Aetius, Majorian, and others show that military strongmen could be both symptom and solution. The aristocracy stands accused. Many elites protected local interests, resisted taxation, adapted to barbarian kings, and failed to support the imperial center with sufficient loyalty. Yet they too responded to reality. Why sacrifice everything for a court that could not protect them? The tax system stands accused. It became heavy, coercive, and increasingly difficult to sustain in the West. But the state needed revenue because defense was expensive. The problem was not taxation alone. It was the shrinking territory over which taxation could function. The loss of Africa stands accused. This may be one of the strongest charges. Without Africa, the Western state lost the fiscal base needed for recovery. Gyseric did not simply take a province. He took the West's ability to pay for survival. Civil war stands accused. Again and again, Roman factions fought each other while frontiers burned. Usurpers, court intrigues, assassinations, rival generals, and dynastic struggles drained the state. External enemies hurt Rome. Internal conflict prevented recovery. Geography stands accused. The West's frontiers were difficult, its capital arrangements unstable, and its provinces more vulnerable to fragmentation than the richer East. Time itself stands accused. The empire had grown from one kind of state into another. Its western half faced pressures that its institutions could no longer absorb quickly enough. But if every suspect is guilty, no one is guilty equally. We need a verdict sharper than everything happened. Chapter 22. What really broke? What broke in the West was the state's ability to turn resources into security. That is the core of the case. A functioning empire collects revenue, pays armies, defends territory, preserves legitimacy, and convinces elites that cooperation is safer than defection. The Western Empire lost that cycle. As territories were invaded or settled by autonomous groups, revenue declined. As revenue declined, armies became harder to pay and maintain. As armies weakened or became dependent on federate groups, central control declined. As central control declined, more territories acted independently or accepted barbarian rulers. As more territories were lost, revenue declined further. This was the death spiral. Political legitimacy also weakened. Emperors depended on generals. Generals depended on troops. Troops demanded land or pay. Land grants reduced direct state control. Aristocrats hedged their loyalties. Barbarian kings offered local security. The imperial court offered tradition, but tradition without protection lost force. The Western Empire did not fall because people forgot that Rome was glorious. It fell because glory could not solve the payment schedule. It fell because the tax base shrank. It fell because armies became politically unstable. It fell because the state killed or undermined effective commanders. It fell because Africa was lost. It fell because recovery required unity, and unity became impossible. It fell because the imperial office remained sacred longer than it remained useful. Chapter 23: The Myth of Decadence. For centuries, people have explained Rome's fall through decadence. Luxury, moral decline, softness, too much comfort, too little virtue. This explanation is emotionally attractive because it makes history feel like moral punishment. Strong people build empires. Weak people lose them. Discipline creates greatness. Corruption destroys it. There is some truth hidden in the moral language, but not enough. The late Roman world was not simply a world of lazy aristocrats reclining while barbarians sharpened axes. It produced formidable soldiers, administrators, theologians, diplomats, lawyers, bishops, generals, and emperors. The Eastern Empire, sharing much of the same late Roman culture and Christianity, survived. Many so-called barbarians admired Roman wealth and systems precisely because Rome remained impressive. The decadence explanation fails because it is too vague. Every age thinks its own elites are decadent. Every crisis produces sermons about moral decline. But empires do not fall because someone wore silk. They fall when institutions cannot solve the problems they exist to solve. Moral language can reveal anxiety, but it cannot replace analysis. The Western Empire's collapse was not a simple punishment for luxury. It was a structural failure under pressure. Chapter 24: The Myth of the Barbarian Flood. Another myth imagines the fall as a flood. Barbarians pour over the borders. Rome drowns. This has drama, but it misses the complexity. The empire was not simply invaded from outside. It had long recruited outsiders, settled them, traded with them, fought them, and transformed them. Many barbarian leaders wanted Roman titles. Many ruled through Roman elites. Many preserved Roman tax and legal systems where useful. The collapse was not the replacement of civilization by pure savagery. Nor were the barbarians always overwhelmingly numerous compared with Roman populations. Their power came from military organization, mobility, leadership, and the weakness of Roman state structures, not from simply filling every province with people overnight. The flood image also hides Roman responsibility. If outsiders alone destroyed Rome, then Roman decisions matter less. But Roman decisions mattered constantly. The treatment of the Goths before Adrianople, the killing of Stilicho, the failure to manage Alaric, the civil wars during the Rhine crisis, the loss of Africa, the killing of Aetius, the execution of Majorian, the failure of the 468 expedition, the court rivalries in Italy, the inability to restore revenue. The West was not murdered by strangers in a dark alley. It bled out through wounds, many of them self-inflicted, while enemies pressed harder every year. Chapter 25, The Myth of 476. The final myth is the date itself. 476. It is useful. It is memorable. It gives us a clean ending. But it risks misunderstanding the disaster. If we imagine Rome fell in 476, we may miss the real turning points. 376, when Goths crossed the Danube and were mishandled. 378, Adrianople. 395, the final division after Theodosius. 406, the Rhine crossing. 410, the sack of Rome. 439, the Vandal capture of Carthage. 451, the last great coalition against Attila. 454, the murder of Aetius. 455, the Vandal sack of Rome. 461, the execution of Majorian. 468, the failed expedition against the Vandals. 475, the overthrow of Julius Nepos in Italy. 476, the deposition of Romulus Augustulus. 480, the death of Nepos. Each date matters. No single date contains the whole. 476 is the moment the Western imperial office in Italy stopped pretending. The empire had already lost Britain, much of Gaul, much of Spain, Africa, effective control over its armies, secure revenue, stable succession, the ability to recover. Romulus Augustulus did not lose the empire. He inherited the absence of one. Chapter 26, could the West have survived? Was the fall inevitable? No. That answer matters. The West was in deep trouble, but history was not scripted. If Stilicho had survived and managed Alaric better, perhaps the early 5th century crisis might have been contained differently. If the Rhine frontier had held, Gaul's fragmentation might have been delayed. If Africa had remained Roman, the West's fiscal base would have been far stronger. If Majorian had recovered Africa, restoration might have been possible. If the 468 expedition had succeeded, the West might have regained revenue and prestige. If emperors and generals had cooperated instead of murdering each other, the state might have lasted longer. If the East had committed more consistently to Western recovery, perhaps some outcomes would change. But every if faces the same problem. The West needed several things to go right in a system where many things kept going wrong. Survival required not one victory, but repeated recovery. By the mid-5th century, the empire's margin for error was tiny. A strong leader could buy time. A successful campaign could restore territory. A wise settlement could stabilize a region. But the structure was so weakened that each failure had disproportionate effects. So the fall was not inevitable in 400. It was much more likely by 450. It was nearly unavoidable after the failure to recover Africa and the destruction of effective Western leadership. History is not fate, but systems can decay until only miracles remain. And miracles are not a policy. Chapter 27, The Last Roman Question. Who was the last Roman? People have given that title to many figures. Stilicho, Aetius, Majorian, Syagrius, who ruled a Roman enclave in northern Gaul after 476 until defeated by the Franks. Boethius, the philosopher-statesman executed under Theodoric. Justinian, the Eastern emperor who tried to reconquer the West. Belisarius, his great general. The question is emotional, not administrative. It asks, when did the old Roman spirit finally disappear? But perhaps the question is misleading. There was no last Roman because Rome did not end as a people, language, law, memory, or identity in one place at one time. Romanitas survived in bishops, aristocrats, laws, cities, armies, chronicles, coins, churches, and the Eastern Empire. It survived in the ambitions of barbarian kings who wanted Roman recognition. It survived in the Latin language of Western Christianity. It survived in the legal imagination of Europe. What ended was not Romanness. What ended was the Western imperial state. This distinction gives the fall its true shape. Rome did not die like a man. It died like a government, then lived on like a ghost, a library, a church, a law code, a city, a dream, and an argument. Chapter 28, The Verdict. The Western Roman Empire fell because it lost the ability to recover. That is the verdict. Not because of one invasion. Not because of one weak emperor. Not because of Christianity. Not because of decadence. Not because of a single battle. It fell because the system that had once turned disaster into recovery became trapped in a cycle where each disaster reduced the tools needed for the next recovery. The Goths exposed military weakness. The Rhine crossing exposed frontier fragility. The sack of Rome exposed symbolic vulnerability. The loss of Africa destroyed fiscal strength. The rise of military strongmen exposed the weakness of imperial office. The killing of effective commanders exposed elite self-sabotage. The failure of 468 exposed the loss of strategic capacity. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus exposed the final irrelevance of the Western emperor in Italy. The West did not fall when barbarians entered the empire. It fell when the empire could no longer make those barbarians serve the Roman state instead of replacing it. It did not fall when Rome was sacked. It fell when the sack could no longer be answered by reconstruction. It did not fall when emperors became weak. It fell when strong men found the imperial office more useful as a puppet than as a command. It did not fall because Roman civilization vanished. It fell because Roman government could no longer hold the Western provinces together. The final disaster was not that Odoacer removed a boy from the throne. The disaster was that removing him changed so little. Chapter 29, The Empire After the Empire. The world that followed was not empty. It was not the Dark Ages, in the crude sense of light suddenly extinguished. It was a world of transformation. The Franks would build power in Gaul. The Visigoths would rule in Spain. The Ostrogoths would govern Italy for a time. The Vandals would hold Africa until Justinian's reconquest. The church would become a central institution in Western life. Latin would evolve. Roman law would be preserved, transformed, and rediscovered. Cities would shrink in some places, survive in others, change everywhere. Trade networks would alter. Local power would matter more. Kingship would take new forms. The Eastern Roman Empire would continue, not as a relic, but as a living empire. The fall of the West was therefore not the end of history. It was the end of a particular political architecture. The Mediterranean ceased to be a single Roman system. The Western provinces became kingdoms. Imperial taxation gave way to new forms of landholding, tribute, and royal power. Roman identity became layered: religious, legal, local, nostalgic, Eastern, papal, barbarian Roman. The empire had fallen in the West, but Rome remained the most powerful memory in the room. For centuries, rulers would try to inherit it. Popes would invoke it. Emperors would revive its name. Kings would imitate it. Lawyers would study it. Cities would claim it. The ghost of Rome proved stronger than many living states. Chapter 30, The Final Autopsy. If the Western Roman Empire were a body on the table, the cause of death would not be a single wound. There would be old scars from the 3rd century, strain in the administrative spine, weakness in the fiscal organs, repeated trauma to the military limbs, a severe hemorrhage where Africa had been cut away, infections from civil war, damage to the political brain, where emperors and generals no longer worked together, external blows from Goths, Vandals, Huns, Franks, Burgundians, and others. And finally, a strange quiet around the heart, because by 476 the system had already lost the force to beat as one body. That is why the fall remains so fascinating. It was not sudden enough to be simple. It was not slow enough to be harmless. It was a collapse made of survivable crises that eventually stopped being survivable. Rome had lived for centuries by absorbing shocks. In the 5th century West, the shocks began absorbing Rome. The Western Roman Empire did not fall because one barbarian chief walked into a palace and ended antiquity. It fell because the Western imperial state lost the relationship that makes empires possible. Revenue-feeding armies, armies defending territory, territory sustaining revenue, and legitimacy persuading elites that the system is worth preserving. Once that circle broke, every crisis became harder to answer than the last. Rome could survive bad emperors, lost battles, religious conflict, invasion, and civil war. It had survived all of them before. What it could not survive was the moment when those disasters began to reinforce each other, when lost provinces meant lost taxes meant weaker armies meant more lost provinces, and the imperial throne became a prize for generals rather than a command center for recovery. And that is why 476 is both important and misleading. It gives us a final scene: a boy emperor removed, imperial insignia sent east, the West quietly admitting that it no longer needed the fiction of its own emperor in Italy. But the real fall had happened in stages: at the Danube, at the Rhine, at Rome, at Carthage, in murdered commanders, in failed fleets, in unpaid armies, in aristocrats adapting to new kings, in taxpayers no longer protected by the state that demanded their loyalty. So what is your verdict? Was the Western Roman Empire killed by barbarian pressure, fiscal collapse, military dependence, elite selfishness, civil war, the loss of Africa, or the simple fact that an empire built for conquest could no longer afford defense? Leave your answer in the comments, and subscribe to the History Docket as we continue reopening the disasters where history did not end in one moment. It failed system by system, until the final act looked almost quiet.